The eerie silence of Fort Carson Military Cemetery was shattered at dawn when Shadow's desperate howls echoed across the neatly arranged headstones. The German Shepherd hadn't stopped barking since Sergeant Daniel Reeves's flag-draped coffin arrived, his cries growing more urgent with each passing hour. When Captain Nathan Miller finally convinced Katherine Reeves to open her husband's casket, their world collapsed. The polished mahogany coffin meant to hold a fallen hero was completely empty. In the distance, a military Humvee's engine roared to life, tires grinding against gravel as it disappeared into the Colorado mountains. "That dog hasn't quieted since they brought the coffin home," whispered Jessica Barnes, Katherine's sister, her voice trembling as they watched the faithful canine companion pacing anxiously by the casket in the Reeves' living room. The morning sunlight streamed through half-drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the room where close friends and family had gathered to pay their respects before the official funeral service. Shadow had been Daniel's partner for 5 years, on the military police K9 unit, serving 2 overseas deployments together. The bond between handler and dog was legendary within their division. When the notification team had arrived 3 days earlier to inform Katherine of Daniel's death during a classified training exercise, Shadow had reacted with immediate distress, refusing food and maintaining a constant vigil by the door as if expecting his handler to walk through at any moment. Katherine Reeves stood by the window, a slender figure silhouetted against the morning light. At 32, her face showed the strain of the past 72 hours, dark circles underlining eyes that had barely closed since receiving the news. Her fingers absently twisted her wedding ring, a simple band engraved with their initials and the date Daniel had proposed during his first leave from deployment 8 years ago. "I don't understand why they're rushing everything," Katherine murmured, watching military officials conferring in hushed tones on her front lawn. 3 days from notification to burial. Daniel deserves more than this. Captain Nathan Miller stood quietly in the corner of the room. He'd been Daniel's commanding officer and closest friend since their days at the military police school at Fort Leonard Wood. His formal dress uniform was impeccable, but his usual composed demeanor had given way to something Katherine couldn't quite identify. Tension, perhaps, or something deeper. "Protocol for classified operations," Miller replied, but something in his voice suggested discomfort with the explanation. "The nature of the accident requires expedited procedures." Shadow's barking suddenly intensified, taking on a sharper, more urgent tone. The German Shepherd planted himself firmly between the coffin and the door, where Colonel Victor Harmon, head of Daniel's Special Operations Unit, had just entered. The dog's hackles rose, a low growl building in his throat. "That's unusual," Jessica observed. "Shadow was always so disciplined around superior officers." Colonel Harmon's weathered face betrayed nothing as he removed his cap, offering condolences to Katherine with practiced formality. "Sergeant Reeves died serving his country with honor and distinction," he stated, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had delivered such news too many times before. "The details remain classified, but you should know he saved lives during his final moments." Shadow continued his aggressive posture, refusing to let the colonel approach the coffin. Katherine had never seen such behavior from the meticulously trained military dog. "Perhaps the animal should be removed during the service," Colonel Harmon suggested, eyeing the dog with thinly veiled irritation. "Grief can make these animals unpredictable." Katherine's spine stiffened. "Shadow stays," she replied, her voice finding unexpected strength. "Daniel would want him here." As military personnel moved through the house, preparing for the service, Katherine noticed Shadow's behavior becoming increasingly strategic. The dog wasn't just barking indiscriminately. He was positioning himself protectively around the coffin, watching each person who approached with careful assessment, reserving his most aggressive responses for certain uniformed officials. The night before the funeral, Katherine found herself alone with Shadow and the coffin. The house had finally emptied of well-meaning visitors, bringing casseroles and condolences. In the stillness, she watched the German shepherd performing a methodical circuit around the casket, sniffing intently at the seams, pawing occasionally at the lid, then looking at her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, kneeling beside the dog. "What are you trying to tell me?" Shadow whined softly, his dark eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. He moved to Daniel's dress uniform jacket hanging over a chair, gently tugging at the pocket until a small, folded piece of paper fell out. Katherine picked it up with trembling fingers, recognizing her husband's precise handwriting. "Trust Shadow. He knows." The cryptic message crystallized the unease that had been building since the notification team had arrived. Daniel had called. The night before his supposed death, his voice tense, words carefully chosen. "Katie, I need you to know something," he'd said. "Whatever happens in the next few days, remember that Timber Lake was where we began, and it's where all paths lead home." The call had disconnected before she could ask what he meant. But Timber Lake had been where he'd proposed, a secluded spot in the Colorado mountains they'd visited every anniversary when he wasn't deployed. Katherine tucked the note into her pocket as Captain Miller returned ostensibly to check on her. Shadow immediately abandoned his vigil by the coffin to stand at Katherine's side, not aggressive but clearly protective. "How are you holding up?" Miller asked, his eyes tracking Shadow's positioning. "Nathan, something doesn't feel right," Katherine confided, their years of friendship allowing her to drop formalities. The rushed funeral, the classified details, Shadow's behavior, and now this. She handed him the note. Miller read it, his expression unreadable. "Daniel always had a special bond with this dog," he said carefully, returning the paper to her. "Military working dogs can sense things we can't." "What things?" Katherine pressed. "Distress, danger." Miller hesitated. "Deception." The word hung between them as Shadow's ears perked up, his attention shifting to the window where a dark SUV had pulled up outside. Two men in civilian clothes but with unmistakably military bearing emerged, speaking briefly with the guards posted at the property entrance. "Security detail for tomorrow's service," Miller explained, though Katherine hadn't asked. "Fort Carson takes the loss of one of its own seriously." That night, Katherine couldn't sleep. She found herself drawn back to the living room, where Shadow maintained his vigilant watch over the coffin. The dog's behavior had evolved from frantic barking to something more deliberate, a focused guardian with a mission. She remembered the day Daniel had brought Shadow home for the first time, explaining the special allowance for the K9 to live with them between deployments. "This isn't just any dog, Katie," he'd told her. "Military working dogs, especially those trained for special operations, can recognize threats we can't even see. They're taught to communicate intelligence, not just react to it." Looking at Shadow now, Katherine wondered what intelligence he was trying to communicate. If Daniel had anticipated some kind of danger, the dog would have been his most trusted ally. Incorruptible, unable to be bought or threatened, programmed through years of training and devotion to complete his handler's final commands. Dawn broke, with Shadow's barking reaching a new intensity. Katherine had dozed off in an armchair, but the dog's urgent cries jerked her awake. He was frantically circling the coffin, pawing at the lid, then running to the window and back again, his pattern clearly communicative rather than random. Jessica arrived early, concerned about her sister spending the night alone. "He's been doing this all night?" she asked, watching Shadow's determined behavior. "Not like this," Katherine replied. "Something's changed. It's like he's responding to something." Captain Miller arrived shortly after, his face grave. "The honor guard will be here in an hour to begin preparations," he informed them. "Colonel Harmon wants to speak with you privately before the service, Katherine." Shadow's reaction to Miller's mention of the colonel was immediate. A low, warning growl that both women recognized as the dog's alert for perceived threat. The same sound he made when unknown vehicles approached their home during Daniel's deployments. "Nathan," Katherine said quietly as Jessica stepped away to make coffee, "you were Daniel's best friend. If there was something wrong, something he couldn't tell me directly, would you know?" Miller's professional composure slipped momentarily, revealing conflicted loyalty. "There are protocols, Katherine. Chain of command considerations. And there are friendship considerations," she countered. "Daniel trusted you with his life. Now I'm asking you to trust me with the truth." Before Miller could respond, Shadow suddenly planted himself at the coffin, his barking taking on a rhythmic, insistent pattern that demanded attention. The dog was practically addressing Katherine now, looking between her and the casket with clear intent. "He wants you to open it," Jessica observed, returning with coffee mugs that steamed in the cool morning air. Katherine approached the coffin slowly, her hand automatically seeking the comfort of the note in her pocket. "Trust, Shadow. He knows. The military officials had strongly advised against opening the casket, citing the nature of Daniel's injuries from the training accident. But what accident could leave no body to bury? This isn't protocol," Miller warned, though he made no move to stop her as she reached for the coffin's latch. "Neither is my husband's dog trying to tell me something this important," Katherine replied, her decision crystallizing. "Shadow has never been wrong, Nathan. Not on duty, not at home." With Jessica's help, Katherine released the casket's secure latches, designed to prevent opening during transport. Miller stood by, his posture suggesting internal conflict between duty and friendship as the women carefully lifted the heavy lid. The polished mahogany coffin was empty. No body, no personal effects, nothing but the standard military casket lining, crisp and undisturbed. In the bottom corner, barely visible against the dark fabric, lay a flash drive secured with military tape. "Oh my God," Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Shadow's barking instantly ceased, replaced by an alert, attentive stance as he watched Katherine's reaction. The dog had completed his mission, delivering his handler's hidden message. "Nathan?" Katherine turned to Miller, whose face had drained of color. "I didn't know," he whispered, staring at the empty coffin. "I swear to you, Katherine, I didn't know it was empty." Through the window, they spotted the dark SUV returning, pulling up alongside Colonel Harmon's car, which had just arrived for the pre-funeral briefing. Shadow's posture immediately shifted to defensive mode, placing himself between Katherine and the approaching threat. "We need to go," Miller said urgently, his loyalty visibly shifting. "Now, before they come inside." "Go where?" Jessica asked. confusion giving way to alarm. Katherine already knew the answer. Daniel's last words suddenly clear. "Timber Lake," she said, reaching for the flash drive. "Where all paths lead home." As they slipped out the back door, Katherine heard Colonel Harmon enter the house, his authoritative voice calling her name. Shadow led the way across the backyard with practiced stealth, guiding them toward Miller's SUV parked on the side street. In the distance, Katherine heard shouting as someone discovered the open, empty coffin. The sound of car doors slamming and radios crackling with urgent communications confirmed what Shadow had been trying to tell them all along. Daniel Reeves wasn't dead, but he was in danger, and now Katherine was too. As Miller drove them away from the house, navigating back roads toward the mountains, Katherine realized this was only the beginning. Whatever truth lay on that flash drive, whatever danger had forced Daniel to fake his own death, she was now part of it. Her husband wasn't in that coffin. He was out there somewhere, and Shadow had just taken the first step in leading her back to him. Katherine Reeves had never imagined herself as someone who would flee her own husband's funeral. As Captain Miller navigated the winding Colorado mountain roads with practiced precision, she watched the military town of Fort Carson shrink in. The distance through the rear window. Shadow sat alert in the back seat beside Jessica, the German Shepherd's mission apparently shifting from warning to protection now that they were in motion. "We need to ditch this vehicle soon," Miller said, checking the rear-view mirror for the 5th time in as many minutes. "Military police will be tracking my SUV as soon as they realize we're gone." Katherine clutched the flash drive in her palm, its edges pressing into her skin. At 32, she had built her entire adult life around the rhythm of military service. The deployments, the homecomings, the constant relocations. She had mastered the art of resilience that came with being a military spouse, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of profound uncertainty. "I still can't believe we just ran from a colonel," Jessica said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Nathan, you could lose everything. Your commission, your pension, everything." Miller's jaw tightened as he took a sharp turn onto a smaller, unpaved road. "Some things matter more than rank," he replied simply. Katherine studied. The man who had been a fixture at their dinner table for years. Captain Nathan Miller had been the straight arrow, the one who followed every regulation to the letter. His career trajectory had been meticulous and deliberate. West Point graduate, decorated combat service, fast-tracked for promotion. Now, he was risking it all, and Katherine needed to understand why. "You know something," she said, not a question but a statement. "About Daniel." Miller's hands flexed on the steering wheel. "Suspicions only, nothing concrete until we saw that empty coffin." "Tell me," Katherine insisted. 3 weeks ago, Daniel came to me off the record, said he'd discovered irregularities in some classified operations, equipment and personnel being diverted without proper documentation, meetings that never appeared in any official calendar. Miller's voice remained measured, but tension radiated from his shoulders. He was investigating quietly, through unofficial channels. Katherine closed her eyes briefly, memories realigning in her mind. Daniel's late nights at the base, his distracted manner, the hushed phone calls that ended when she entered the room. She had attributed it all to the classified nature of his recent assignments. Now she wondered what her husband had uncovered that was worth faking his own death. "The last time I saw him," Miller continued, "he mentioned creating contingency. Plans, said if anything happened to him, Shadow would know what to do." He glanced at the dog in the rearview mirror. I thought he was being paranoid. Military police canine handlers sometimes develop an almost mystical trust in their dog's abilities. Shadow whined softly from the back seat, as if understanding he was being discussed. He wasn't being paranoid, Katherine said quietly. He was being unprepared. Jessica leaned forward from the back seat. But why the empty coffin? Why not just disappear if he was in danger? Because an AWOL MP raises immediate alarms, triggers manhunts, Miller explained. A dead soldier is mourned and forgotten by the system. His records get archived, his case is reassigned. It buys time. Katherine turned the flash drive over in her hands, wondering what secrets it contained. Daniel had always been meticulous in his work, thorough in his documentation. If he had found something dangerous enough to warrant such extreme measures, the evidence would be comprehensive. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked, recognizing the route toward Timber Lake. The pristine mountain lake, nestled in the Colorado wilderness, had been their special place, the site of numerous anniversaries and reunions after deployments. It made sense as a rendezvous point, somewhere with personal significance that wouldn't appear suspicious in any official records. Daniel maintained a hunting cabin in those mountains, Miller replied. Off the books, purchased through a shell. A company, military real estate records wouldn't connect it to him. Katherine blinked in surprise. He never mentioned owning property up there. That was the point, Miller said grimly. Operational security. He called it his contingency location. Somewhere to go if things went sideways. Only told me about it after the third bourbon the night before his last deployment. The revelation stung, another secret in what was apparently a marriage full of them. Katherine had always understood that Daniel's work required confidentiality, but this went beyond professional discretion. This was a parallel life, preparations made for a scenario she'd never been warned about. As they drove deeper into the mountains, phone reception bars disappeared one by one. Katherine's military-issue phone buzzed with a final text before losing signal completely. Emergency alert. Report any sightings of CPT Miller, Katherine Reeves. Or military working dog Shadow to MP command immediately. All three considered persons of interest in ongoing security matter. That was fast, Jessica murmured, showing Katherine her civilian phone with the same alert. They're casting a wide net, Miller observed, pulling onto an even smaller Forest Service road, which means they don't know exactly what Daniel had or who he might have told. An hour later, they abandoned the SUV in a public campground parking lot, transferring to Jessica's Honda Civic that had been following their prearranged exit strategy. The civilian vehicle would attract less attention than Miller's distinctive officer's SUV. As they continued their journey in the less conspicuous car, Katherine felt Shadow press against her leg from the back seat, his warm presence a reminder of Daniel's foresight. The dog had been more than a partner to him. He had been an insurance policy, a messenger who couldn't be compromised or coerced. Katherine's mind drifted to the day Daniel had brought Shadow home for the first time. The German Shepherd had been just over 2 years old, already fully trained in explosive detection, patrol operations, and handler protection. Daniel had explained that Shadow had been specially selected for advanced training in a classified program. He can detect changes in human physiology, Daniel had told her proudly. Heart rate, respiration, subtle chemical changes in perspiration. Essentially, he's a living lie detector, That's why they paired us. My background in military intelligence combined with his detection capabilities makes us particularly effective at screening operations. Katherine had laughed then, joking that she'd have to be careful about surprise birthday planning. Now, she realized that Shadow's specialized training explained his aggressive behavior toward Colonel Harmon and certain other officers. The dog hadn't just been barking at an empty coffin, he'd been alerting to deception in the humans around it. Daniel used to say that Shadow could smell a lie at 50 paces. She said aloud, "I thought he was exaggerating." Miller shook his head. That program is classified but not exaggerated. Selected K9s with exceptional sensory capabilities are trained to alert on subconscious indicators of deception. Shadow is one of the best. That's why Daniel specifically requested him for certain security screening operations. They drove in silence for a while, the road growing steeper and rougher as they ascended into the mountains. Timber Lake was located in a remote area above the tree line, accessible only by a single service road during summer months. In winter, it was completely isolated except by helicopter. "We're lucky it's June," Miller commented as they navigated a particularly rough stretch. "Another month and this road would be washed out from the snowmelt." Daniel chose his timing carefully, Katherine realized, faking his death when the cabin would be accessible by road. Jessica, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up from the driver's seat. "Katie, I need to know what we're walking into. These are serious people we're running from. Military police, special operations, colonels. What happens if we find Daniel? What happens if we don't?" Katherine had been asking herself the same questions. The Daniel she knew, or thought she knew, was honorable, dedicated to his oath. And his country, whatever he had discovered, must have been significant enough to justify these extraordinary measures. "If Daniel went to these lengths," she said slowly, "then what he found threatened something fundamental. He wouldn't fake his death over a simple criminal matter or even standard corruption. This is bigger." Miller nodded in agreement. The units Daniel was screening were special access programs, black operations with minimal oversight, the kind of operations where accountability is flexible. The implication hung heavily in the car. Shadow shifted restlessly in the back seat, sensing the tension. As they rounded a final curve, Timber Lake came into view, its crystal waters reflecting the afternoon sun. Nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered mountains, it looked exactly as it had when Daniel proposed 8 years ago, pristine, isolated, and seemingly untouched by the complications of the world below. Jessica parked at the small ranger station that marked the lake's public access point. From here, they would need to continue on foot, following hiking trails that would eventually lead to the private properties scattered around the lake's perimeter. Daniel's. "A cabin is on the north shore," Miller explained, studying a topographical map he'd pulled from his pack. "About 3 miles by trail. We should reach it before sunset if we move quickly." As they gathered essential supplies from the car, Katherine noticed Shadow's behavior changing once again. The dog's ears were perked forward, his attention fixed on the trail ahead, body language shifting from alert to anticipatory. He wasn't warning of danger now. He was expecting something, or someone. "He knows where we're going," Katherine realized. Aloud, "He's been here before." Miller shouldered his pack. "Daniel probably used this place for training exercises." Shadow would remember. With the German shepherd leading the way, they set off on the hiking trail, leaving behind the last vestiges of civilization. Katherine felt a strange sense of clarity. emerging through her grief and confusion. For days, she had been a widow in shock, moving through funeral preparations with numb compliance. Now, with each step into the wilderness, she was transforming into something else, a woman with purpose, following a trail of breadcrumbs left by a husband who had trusted her enough to find him. Shadow stayed close to Katherine, occasionally, looking back as if to ensure she was still following. The dog's confidence was reassuring, a tangible connection to Daniel, and a reminder that this journey had been planned, that they weren't simply fleeing into the unknown. As they hiked deeper into the forest, Jessica asked the question Katherine had been avoiding. What if this is all some kind of misunderstanding? What if there really was an accident, and the empty coffin is, I don't know, some weird military protocol? Then, why would Colonel Harmon lie about it? Miller countered. Why the rush to bury an empty coffin? Why the security alerts when we disappeared? And why would Daniel leave me that note? Katherine added. Trust Shadow, he knows. She reached down to touch the dog's head, drawing strength from his solid presence. Whatever the truth is, I need to find it. I owe Daniel that much. The trail grew steeper, winding through dense pine forest. Katherine felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, knowing that whatever information it contained would soon transform their understanding of Daniel's disappearance. Ahead of them lay a cabin that her husband had kept secret, perhaps containing answers that would change everything she believed about their life together. Shadow suddenly stopped, his posture stiffening as he stared intently at something ahead on the trail. Katherine followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual among the trees and undergrowth. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. The German shepherd let out a single, sharp bark, not a warning, but a signal. Then he bounded forward, disappearing around a bend in the trail. "Shadow," Katherine called, hurrying after him with Miller and Jessica close behind. When they rounded the curve, they saw Shadow sitting calmly beside a large pine tree. At the base of the tree, partially concealed by a fallen log, was a small metal case, bearing the emblem of Daniel's military police canine unit. Katherine approached slowly, her heart racing. This was no coincidence. This was another breadcrumb, another piece of the trail Daniel had left for her to follow. Shadow watched expectantly as she knelt beside the case. It wasn't locked, suggesting it was meant to be found by the right person. Inside lay a satellite phone, a set of keys, and a folded map with the location circled in red marker. "He's guiding us," Katherine whispered, understanding dawning. Step by step, Miller examined the satellite phone. Secure communication, can't be easily tracked. Daniel thought of everything. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the trail, Katherine felt a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. Her husband was alive. She was certain of it now. But the elaborate nature of his disappearance suggested dangers she could barely comprehend. Shadow pressed against her leg, his warm presence a reminder of the bond that connected her to Daniel. Even in his absence, whatever lay ahead at the cabin on Timber Lake, she would face it with the same courage that had driven her husband to protect his discoveries with such extraordinary measures. "We should keep moving," Miller urged, glancing at the darkening sky. "If Daniel left that cache for us to find, he's confirming we're on the right track. The cabin can't be far now." With renewed determination, Katherine pocketed the satellite, the phone and keys, then studied the map with its cryptic markings. The circled location wasn't at the lake at all, but a point half a mile beyond it, a deviation from their expected destination. "He's not at the cabin," she realized. This is pointing somewhere else." Shadow barked once in what seemed like confirmation, then turned to continue up the trail, his mission clear, even if their destination had changed. Katherine followed, the weight of uncertainty lifting slightly with each step. Daniel was out there, and he was leaving a path for her to follow. Whatever truth awaited at the end of that path, Katherine was finally ready to face it. The forest grew denser as Katherine, Miller, and Jessica followed Shadow along the unmarked trail beyond Timber Lake. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in diminishing patches as evening approached, casting long shadows across their path. The satellite phone weighed heavily in Katherine's pocket, its presence both reassuring and troubling. Daniel had planned for this moment, had created this elaborate trail of breadcrumbs, yet hadn't trusted anyone enough to simply tell them what was happening. The coordinates on the map lead to a ridgeline about half a mile ahead, Miller said, studying the topography with a practiced eye. Defensible position, good visibility of the surrounding area. Sounds like Daniel, Katherine replied. Her husband had always thought tactically, evaluating environments for advantages and vulnerabilities even during family vacations. It was a habit formed through years of military police training and combat deployments, one that had apparently served him well in planning his own disappearance. Shadow maintained a steady pace ahead of them, occasionally glancing back to ensure they were following. The German shepherd's confidence in their route never wavered, suggesting he had traveled this path many times before with Daniel. "I can't believe he trained Shadow for all of this," Jessica marveled, watching the dog navigate. "A particularly steep section of trail. It's like something out of a spy movie." Military working dogs are capable of complex mission parameters, Miller explained. Daniel specialized in training K9s to operate independently if handlers were compromised. Shadow isn't just following a familiar path. He's executing a contingency plan. As they crested a small hill, Katherine stopped abruptly, her attention caught by something unnatural among the trees. Partially concealed by camouflage netting was a motion-activated camera mounted to a trunk, its lens pointed directly at the trail. "We're being watched," she whispered. Miller approached the camera cautiously, examining it without touching the device. Military-grade surveillance, battery-powered, probably transmitting to a remote receiver. "Is it Daniel's?" Jessica asked, visibly unnerved. "Or someone's looking for him," Miller replied grimly. Shadow showed no concern about the camera, continuing confidently along the trail. His behavior suggested the surveillance was expected, perhaps part of Daniel's security measures rather than a threat. Katherine checked the satellite phone again, still powered off, as Miller had advised to prevent tracking. The temptation to turn it on, to possibly hear Daniel's voice or receive instructions, was nearly overwhelming. But years as a military spouse had taught her the value of patience and protocol in uncertain situations. The trail narrowed as they approached the ridgeline, forcing them to proceed in single file with Shadow leading. The German shepherd suddenly froze, his body language shifting from confident guidance to alert caution. His ears pricked forward, head lowered slightly as he scanned the terrain ahead. Miller signaled for them to stop, his hand instinctively moving to where his service weapon would normally be holstered. As a captain on administrative leave, he had been required to surrender his firearm, a fact that clearly frustrated him now. "Something's wrong," Katherine whispered, recognizing Shadow's alert posture from countless demonstrations Daniel had conducted. The dog turned to Katherine, then deliberately moved a few paces off the trail into the underbrush, looking back expectantly. The message was clear. They needed to leave the main path. Miller nodded his understanding. He's detected something. Could be human presence, could be a surveillance trigger point. Following Shadow's lead, they carefully picked their way through the dense vegetation parallel to the main trail. The dog moved with practiced stealth, placing each paw deliberately to minimize sound. Katherine imitated his movements as best she could, impressed and unsettled by how well Daniel had prepared his canine partner for this scenario. After several tense minutes, Shadow led them back to the trail beyond whatever had triggered his caution. The dog's demeanor relaxed slightly, though he remained more vigilant than before. "Do you think someone else is out here?" Jessica whispered, her city experience leaving her ill-equipped for the heightened tension of their wilderness evasion. "Possibly," Miller replied, "or Shadow detected signs of recent activity. Either way, we need to assume we're not alone up here." The ridgeline came into view through the trees as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant orange and purple hues. From this elevation, they could see the sprawling landscape of the Colorado Rockies, stretching for miles. Timber Lake, a small sapphire, nestled among the pines below. In the far distance, the lights of Fort Carson and Colorado Springs twinkled to life as darkness descended. Shadow led them to a rocky outcrop that seemed unremarkable until Katherine noticed the subtle signs of human presence, boot prints in the softer earth, small areas where the natural arrangement of stones had been disturbed. The dog approached a particularly large boulder and sat beside it, looking at Katherine expectantly. "I think we're here," she said, examining the area more closely. Miller circled the boulder, his trained eye spotting what civilians might miss. "Look at the lichen patterns on these rocks," he observed. "Some of these have been moved recently." Together, they began examining the formation, looking for anything that might indicate the next step in Daniel's trail. Shadow watched patiently, making no move to guide them further. Katherine ran her hand along the base of the boulder, feeling for irregularities. Near the ground, her fingers detected a small recess containing something metallic. She carefully extracted a concealed key, similar to those used for military storage lockers, but unmarked. "Found something," she announced, holding up the key. Shadow immediately stood at attention, his mission apparently advancing as planned. "Now we just need to figure out what it opens," Jessica said, scanning the rocky area. Miller was already examining the largest boulder more systematically. "Natural formations like this don't typically have perfectly flat surfaces," he muttered, pressing against different sections of the rock face. "Unless..." With a soft click, a section of the stone surface shifted slightly. Miller pressed harder, revealing what appeared to be a disguised access panel built to mimic the natural rock texture. The key fit perfectly into the concealed lock. Daniel built a hidden bunker, Katherine realized, a mixture of awe and disbelief in her voice. The level of preparation this represented went far beyond normal contingency planning. Whatever her husband had uncovered must have been significant enough to warrant creating an elaborate underground facility. The panel swung open to reveal a narrow passage leading downward, built into the natural cave system beneath the ridge. Motion-activated lights flickered to life as Shadow confidently led the way inside, clearly familiar with the facility. "I can't believe he kept all this secret," Katherine murmured as they descended into the bunker. "Compartmentalization," Miller explained. Standard protocol when investigating internal threats. The fewer people who know, the smaller the circle of potential leaks. The passage opened into a surprisingly well-equipped underground room, approximately 15 feet square. A generator hummed quietly in one corner, powering the lighting system and several electronic devices. A basic living area had been established with military-style efficiency. Cot, compact kitchen setup, communications equipment, and most prominently, a workstation with multiple monitors currently in sleep mode. Shadow immediately went to a cabinet near the cot, pawing at its door until Katherine opened it. Inside were basic supplies and a sealed envelope with her name written in Daniel's distinctive handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, half afraid and half desperate, to connect with her husband through his words. "Katie," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Shadow has successfully completed the first phase of his mission. I'm sorry for the deception and pain I've caused you. The empty coffin was necessary, the only way to bide time while creating the appearance that I was no longer a threat to certain operations within the base." Katherine paused, steadying herself against the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Miller and Jessica remained respectfully silent as she continued reading. "What I discovered goes beyond standard corruption or criminal activity. There's a group operating within Fort Carson Special Operations Command that has been facilitating unauthorized weapons transfers to non-allied entities overseas. The scale is massive. Millions in advanced weaponry diverted through falsified mission reports and training losses. When I began connecting personnel to specific transfers, I received my first warning, a staged accident during training that nearly succeeded." Katherine remembered that incident from 3 months earlier, Daniel coming home with minor injuries from what he'd described as a vehicle rollover during routine exercises. He'd been uncharacteristically quiet about the details, which she had attributed to his general reluctance to worry her with the dangers of his work. "Colonel Victor Harmon is coordinating these operations," the letter continued. "His public record is impeccable, but I've documented multiple instances where he authorized equipment transfers that never reached their designated destinations. When equipment from these lost shipments began appearing in conflict zones where we have no official presence, I knew this wasn't simple profiteering." Miller leaned against the workstation, his expression hardening. "Victor Harmon," he muttered. "Daniel tried to warn me about him indirectly a month ago, said I should be careful about which senior officers I shared operational details with." Katherine continued reading, each word of Daniel's letter reshaping her understanding of the past. "Several months. The flash drive contains everything I've documented, including surveillance footage, financial transfers, and falsified requisition orders. But the most damning evidence is on the secured server in this bunker. I've been tracking these operations for nearly a year, building a case that even the most connected officers couldn't escape." "A year," Katherine whispered, the timeline settling heavily in her stomach. For 12 months, Daniel had been living a double life. Dedicated MP and loving husband by day, solo investigator by night. She thought of the late hours he'd attributed to administrative work, the training exercises that took him away for days at a time. "I've arranged a secure meeting through channels I trust," the letter continued. "By the time you read this, I should be gathering the final piece of evidence, documentation of the offshore accounts where the proceeds from these weapons sales are being held. Once secured, we can take this to the proper authorities outside." The normal chain of command. Katherine looked up from the letter, meeting Miller's concerned gaze. He's still out there, gathering evidence, which means he's still in danger, Miller concluded. The final paragraphs of Daniel's letter contained specific instructions. The satellite phone is programmed with one contact. Use it only when you've reached this bunker. Shadow knows additional. Rally points if this location is compromised. Trust Nathan if he's with you. He wasn't involved, and I've left him clues he'd recognize. Most importantly, Katie, trust yourself. Your intelligence analysis background is exactly what's needed to understand the evidence I've gathered. Katherine folded the letter carefully, her mind racing to process its implications. The Daniel she thought she knew, straightforward, by-the-book military policeman, had been conducting a complex undercover investigation against his own command. Structure. He had built a hidden bunker, trained his K-9 for elaborate contingency operations, and arranged his own fake death. I need to see what's on that flash drive, she said, turning toward the workstation. Miller nodded, moving to power up the computer system. Daniel's letter mentioned a secure server. This setup is isolated from outside networks, designed to prevent remote access or tracking. As the monitors flickered to life, Shadow suddenly tensed, his attention shifting to the entrance passage. A low growl built in his throat, not the alert barking from the coffin, but the warning sound of detected threat. "Someone's coming," Miller whispered, immediately moving to dim the lights. Katherine pocketed Daniel's letter and the flash drive, adrenaline sharpening her senses. "Is there another way out?" Miller scanned the room quickly. There has to be. Daniel wouldn't build a bunker with only one exit. Shadow was already moving, heading to what appeared to be a solid rock wall at the back of the room. The dog pawed at a specific section, looking back at Katherine insistently. Jessica discovered the hidden release mechanism, a pressure plate disguised as a natural rock formation. A narrow passage appeared, obviously designed as an emergency. "Escape route, go!" Miller urged, grabbing a backpack from near the workstation. "I'll copy what I can from the server and follow." Katherine hesitated, reluctant to separate. "We stay together." 30 seconds, Miller insisted. "I need to make sure this evidence is preserved. If Daniel risked everything to collect it, we can't leave it behind." From the main entrance tunnel, they heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Shadow's growl deepened, his body positioning protectively in front of Katherine. 29 seconds, Katherine agreed reluctantly. "Then we all leave together." As Miller worked feverishly to download files from Daniel's server, Katherine and Jessica prepared for their escape, gathering supplies from the bunker's stores. Shadow remained focused on the entrance, his specialized training allowing him to assess the approaching threat with precision beyond human capability. The dog's posture communicated everything Katherine needed to know. Whoever was coming down that tunnel wasn't friendly, wasn't Daniel, and represented immediate danger. The trust Daniel had placed in his K-9 partner had already proven justified multiple times over. Now, as they prepared to flee into the darkness of an emergency tunnel with unknown pursuers behind them, that trust might be the difference between life and death. Katherine checked the satellite phone, still powered off according to Daniel's instructions. The moment to make contact hadn't arrived yet. First, they needed to escape, to continue following the trail of breadcrumbs her husband had left for them. The inciting incident of discovering his empty coffin had set her on this path, but Katherine now understood it was merely the first step in a journey whose destination remained shrouded in mystery. "Time's up," she told Miller, as Shadow's warning growl intensified. "We need to move, now." The escape tunnel was narrow and roughly hewn, forcing them to move in single file, with Shadow leading the way. The dog navigated the darkness with confidence, while Katherine, Jessica, and Miller used small tactical flashlights to illuminate. The uneven ground. The sound of voices echoed from the bunker behind them, muffled but unmistakably urgent. "They've found the main entrance," Miller whispered, carefully securing the hidden door behind them. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they discover this passage." Katherine fought to control her breathing as they hurried through the cramped tunnel. The emotional whiplash of the past 24 hours threatened to overwhelm her. Grief transformed to confusion, then hope, and now fear. Her husband wasn't dead, but he was in danger. The man she'd loved and built a life with had been leading a double existence, investigating corruption within his own command structure. "I keep thinking about all the nights he came home late," she said quietly, as they navigated a particularly tight section of tunnel. "All the weekends he spent catching up on paperwork or training with Shadow. He was here, building this, preparing for everything to fall apart." Jessica reached forward in the darkness, squeezing her sister's shoulder. "He was protecting you, Katie, keeping you separate from the danger, by lying to me for a year." The hurt in Katherine's voice was raw, despite her efforts to suppress it. "We promised each other no secrets, not after his first deployment, when he tried to shield me from the reality of what he'd experienced. That nearly broke us." Miller's voice came from behind them, measured and careful. "Operational security isn't the same as personal deception, Katherine. Daniel wouldn't have compartmentalized you out of distrust. Quite the opposite. The less you knew, the safer you were." The tunnel began to slope upward, suggesting they were approaching an exit. Shadow paused at a junction where the passage split in 2 directions, looking back at Katherine expectantly. "Which way, boy?" she whispered. The German shepherd deliberated for a moment, sniffing both options before confidently selecting the left passage. Katherine trusted the dog's instincts without hesitation. Shadow had earned that faith repeatedly since this ordeal began. As they continued their escape, Katherine's mind returned to Daniel's letter. The weapons transfers he'd uncovered weren't simply a case of profiteering or corruption. They represented a fundamental betrayal of everything the military stood for. These were American weapons being deliberately diverted to non-allied forces, potentially endangering U.S. personnel overseas. If Colonel Harmon and his associates were willing to fake Daniel's death to cover their tracks, what else might they do to protect their operation? The tunnel eventually opened into a small cave, whose entrance was concealed by thick vegetation. Shadow navigated the final obstacles with practiced ease, emerging into the nighttime forest approximately half a mile from where they had entered the bunker. The mountain air felt crisp and clean after the confined staleness of the underground passage. Miller quickly assessed their position using the map they'd found earlier. "Daniel planned this well," he observed. "This exit puts terrain features between us and the bunker's main entrance. Anyone pursuing would have to circle around that ridgeline to reach this position." Katherine checked the satellite phone, considering whether it was time to make contact. Daniel's instructions had been specific: use it only after reaching the bunker. They had fulfilled that condition, but the unexpected arrival of pursuers had complicated matters. "We need somewhere secure to examine the flash drive," she decided, pocketing the phone again. "And we need to put more distance between us and whoever was entering the bunker." Shadow seemed to agree. already moving purposefully through the trees in a direction that led them further from the ridgeline and deeper into the wilderness. The dog's training for woodland operations was evident in his movement patterns, maintaining cover, selecting routes that minimized their visibility from higher ground. "Who do you think was in the bunker?" Jessica asked as they followed Shadow through the darkening forest. "Military police searching for us? Or Harmon's people looking for Daniel's evidence?" "Could be both," Miller replied grimly. "MP units would have been activated as soon as we fled the funeral, but Harmon wouldn't trust standard procedures for something this sensitive. He'd deploy trusted personnel from his direct command." Katherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain night air. "So we could be hunted by both legitimate military authorities and corrupt special operations forces who want to eliminate witnesses and evidence." The reality of their situation settled heavily upon her shoulders. Until 24 hours ago, she had been a grieving military widow, surrounded by the support structure of the base community. Now, she was a fugitive in the Colorado wilderness, pursued by unknown forces, with only her sister, her husband's best friend, and a German shepherd for allies. Shadow led them to a small clearing where a fallen tree created a natural windbreak. The dog circled the area methodically, checking for threats before sitting beside the log, signaling it was safe to rest momentarily. Katherine took the opportunity to examine the satellite phone more closely. The device was military-grade, designed for secure communications in remote locations. A single button would connect them to whatever contact Daniel had programmed, presumably himself or someone he trusted implicitly. What if it's a trap? Jessica voiced the concern that had been nagging at Katherine. What if Daniel's already been captured and they're waiting for us to make contact? Miller shook his head. Daniel would have contingencies for that scenario. The contact protocol likely includes verification methods, phrases or challenges that would alert us if he's compromised. Katherine's finger hovered over the call button, the weight of the decision pressing upon her. Everything hinged on trusting Daniel's planning, his foresight, his ability to anticipate how events would unfold. The same husband who had kept her in the dark for a year, who had allowed her to believe he was dead. "I need a moment," she said quietly, moving a short distance away from the others. In the solitude of the forest darkness, Katherine finally confronted the emotional turmoil she'd been suppressing since opening that empty coffin. Anger, relief, betrayal, hope. They collided within her like opposing storm fronts, powerful and unpredictable. The foundation of her marriage, which she had believed solid despite the challenges of military life, had been fractured by Daniel's secrets. Yet beneath the hurt lay understanding. Daniel was a man who had sworn to defend his country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He had discovered domestic enemies at the highest levels of his command structure, a situation with no clear protocol, no safe reporting chain. His actions, while painful to her personally, reflected his unwavering commitment to that oath. Shadow approached silently, pressing against her leg in a gesture of comfort. The dog's devotion transcended his military training. He sensed her distress and responded with simple, unconditional support. "He trusted you completely," Katherine whispered, running her fingers through the German shepherd's thick fur. "Trained you for this exact scenario, knowing you wouldn't fail him, wouldn't fail us." Shadow's warm presence anchored her, providing clarity amid the emotional turbulence. Whatever personal pain Daniel's decisions had caused, the stakes extended far beyond their marriage. Lives were at risk from these diverted weapons. Daniel himself was in danger, having faked his death to buy time for his investigation. Katherine returned to where Miller and Jessica waited. "I'm making the call," she announced, her voice steady with newfound resolve. Daniel risked everything to expose this conspiracy. I won't let fear or hurt stop me from helping him finish what he started. She pressed the call button on the satellite phone, her heart pounding as it established a connection. After 3 rings, a voice answered, not Daniel's, but a woman's, unfamiliar and cautious. "Authentication phrase required," the voice stated. Flatly, Katherine froze momentarily before remembering Daniel's letter. "Timber Lake is where all paths lead home," she replied, quoting the cryptic message from his last phone call. A pause then. Secondary authentication. What was intercepted? In the third quarter of the homecoming game? The question made Katherine smile, despite their dire circumstances. It referenced their first date, a high school football game where Daniel had intercepted a pass in the third quarter, securing the win for their team. A forward pass by Marcus Jenkins, quarterback for the Falcons, she answered confidently. Another pause, longer this time. Katherine held her breath, aware that everything depended on passing this verification process. Finally, the woman's voice returned, warmer now. Authentication confirmed. Stand by for secure transmission of rendezvous coordinates. Maintain satellite phone power for precisely 7 minutes, then disconnect and remove battery until designated contact time at 600 tomorrow. Wait! Katherine interrupted urgently. "Who are you? Where's Daniel?" "Sergeant First Class Rebecca Townsend, U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division," the woman replied. "I'm Daniel's handler for this operation. He's secure but unable to make direct contact at this time. The coordinates being transmitted will lead you to a safe location with further instructions." The phone beeped softly, indicating incoming data. Miller moved closer, ready to record the information. "Is Daniel all right?" Katherine pressed, unwilling to disconnect without some confirmation of her husband's safety. "He was when I last had contact," Rebecca answered carefully, "but our window is closing. You need to move quickly, Mrs. Reeves. You're not the only ones in those mountains tonight." The transmission completed with another soft beep. Miller quickly noted the coordinates on their map. 3 minutes remaining on secure connection, Rebecca continued. "Use them wisely if you have critical information to relay." Katherine made a split-second decision. "We were pursued at the bunker. Unknown forces entered as we escaped through the emergency tunnel. They may have accessed the secured server." "Understood. Contingency protocols are in place for server compromise." "What physical evidence did you recover?" "Flash drive from the Coffin, letter with operational details." "Daniel's personal effects from the bunker," Miller reported concisely. "Good. Bring everything to the rendezvous point." Rebecca's voice remained professional but carried an undercurrent of urgency. 2-minute warning on connection. Any other critical information? Katherine thought of Shadow, of the dog's unwavering performance throughout this ordeal. "Tell Daniel that Shadow completed his mission perfectly, every step exactly as trained." For the first time, something like emotion colored Rebecca's voice. He'll be glad to hear that. He was concerned the Coffin scenario might be too complex, even for Shadow's training. "One more thing," Katherine added as their time dwindled. "Tell him I understand why he did it, not just the fake death, all of it. Tell him I'm ready to help finish what he started." "I'll relay the message," Rebecca promised. 30 seconds. Disconnect and move immediately after our call ends. Trust. Shadow's training. Daniel programmed him with recognition protocols for the safe house location. As the call concluded and Miller disabled the satellite phone as instructed, Katherine felt a curious sense of calm replacing her earlier turmoil. The emotional stakes had clarified into sharp focus. This wasn't just about her marriage or Daniel's deception. It was about American weapons being funneled to enemies, about corruption at the highest levels of military command, about the oath Daniel had taken and the lengths he would go to uphold it. Shadow stood alert at the edge of their small clearing, already oriented toward their next destination. The dog had become more than just Daniel's messenger. He was their guardian, their guide through physical and emotional wilderness. "Let's go," Katherine said with quiet determination. "We have a rendezvous to make." As they prepared to move out, following Shadow once more into the darkness, Katherine understood that her life had irrevocably changed. Whatever happened next, whatever truths awaited at the rendezvous coordinates, she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The emotional stakes weren't just about finding Daniel anymore. They were about standing beside him in a fight that mattered, that reached beyond their personal relationship into something that affected countless lives. For the first time since this ordeal began, Katherine felt not just determined, but purposeful. Daniel had trusted her enough to leave a path for her to follow. Now she would show him that his trust had not been misplaced. The mountain terrain grew increasingly challenging as they navigated toward the rendezvous coordinates. Shadow led them confidently through the darkness, selecting paths that balanced direct routing with security considerations. The German shepherds. Specialized training was evident in every decision, avoiding ridgelines where they might be silhouetted against the night sky, selecting routes with overhead cover, pausing periodically to listen and scent the air for potential threats. Daniel spent months up here, Miller observed, as they carefully picked their way down a steep slope. Training Shadow, building the bunker, documenting the weapons transfers. No wonder he looked exhausted most mornings at the base. Katherine nodded, remembering how she'd attributed her husband's fatigue to the demands of his official duties. He was working 2 full-time jobs, his assigned post and this investigation, all while maintaining a normal home life to avoid raising suspicions. The rendezvous coordinates placed their destination in a remote valley approximately 4 miles from the bunker. According to Miller's assessment, they would reach it shortly before dawn if they maintained their current pace. As they walked, Katherine found her thoughts returning to the beginning of Daniel's military career, searching for clues she might have missed. Signs that might have foretold his eventual role as a whistleblower investigating his own command. "When did you and Daniel first meet?" Jessica asked, seemingly reading her sister's thoughts. "Senior year of high school," Katherine replied, a faint smile forming despite their circumstances. "The famous football interception Rebecca mentioned. During authentication, he was already planning to enlist, had his heart set on military police because his father had served in the same branch." The memory transported her momentarily away from their present danger. He was so idealistic back then, believed completely in the mission, in the oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies. His father had instilled this powerful sense of duty in him from childhood. Miller nodded, having heard these stories during countless dinners at their home. Daniel's father was old-school military, career NCO, who believed in the system, in the chain of command. raised Daniel to respect authority, but also to stand firm on moral principles. "That's what makes this situation so difficult to reconcile," Katherine continued as they paused to rest briefly. Daniel revered the military hierarchy. For him to go outside that chain of command, to essentially become a vigilante investigator, something profound must have happened. Shadow whined softly from his position a few yards ahead, signaling they should resume movement. The dog's internal clock seemed precisely calibrated to their timeline, understanding the importance of reaching their destination by dawn. As they continued their journey through the wilderness, Katherine began piecing together the backstory that had led to their current situation, drawing on fragments of conversations and incidents that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now formed a pattern. "I think it started with Operation Switchback," she said, after they had walked in silence for some time. "About 14 months ago, Daniel was assigned to provide K9 security screening for equipment transfers between units. He came home troubled. After the first week, Miller's attention sharpened visibly. Switchback was classified, but rumors circulated. Some special operations equipment went missing, officially written off as training losses. Daniel couldn't discuss details, but he mentioned discrepancies in the inventory counts, said he'd brought it up with his command and been told to focus on his assigned duties. Katherine recalled her husband's uncharacteristic frustration that evening, the way he'd paced their kitchen after dinner, Shadow watching him with concerned eyes. A month later, he volunteered for additional shifts on those transfers. Said it was for the overtime pay, but that never made sense. Daniel always prioritized home time over extra money. The pieces were aligning in Katherine's mind, creating a timeline of her husband's gradual transition from dutiful soldier to covert investigator. "That's when the late nights started," she continued. "He'd come home with that distant look, the one he used to get after difficult deployments. When I'd ask about his day, he'd deflect with vague comments about administrative backlogs or training exercises." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Around that same time, he began asking me hypothetical questions about evidence chains and reporting, procedures for suspected internal malfeasance. I thought he was preparing for promotion boards. Those topics sometimes appear in the scenarios they test." "Then came the accident 3 months ago," Katherine said, her voice tightening at the memory. "The vehicle rollover during training. Daniel came home with minor injuries, but something had changed. He was watchful, started varying his routes to and from the base, checking his phone for monitoring software, having important conversations outside where they couldn't be recorded." Jessica, who had been listening intently, connected another dot. "That's when he asked me to set up that secure email account for him, isn't it? Said he needed it for a surprise anniversary gift for you." Katherine stopped walking momentarily, surprised by this revelation. "I never received any anniversary gift associated with an email account." "Because it wasn't for a gift," Miller concluded grimly. He was establishing secure communications outside military networks. Shadow returned from his forward position, nudging Katherine gently to resume movement. The dog's insistent guidance prevented them from dwelling too long in any location, a tactical consideration that Daniel had clearly trained into him. As they continued toward the rendezvous point, the full picture of Daniel's double life emerged through their shared recollections. Katherine described how Shadow's training had intensified during the same period, with Daniel focusing on independent operations and complex command chains that seemed excessive for standard military police work. He was preparing Shadow to operate. Without him, Miller observed, training the dog to continue the mission if they became separated, or if Daniel had to disappear, Katherine added quietly. The most significant revelation came as they descended into the valley, designated in their rendezvous coordinates. Miller, who had been somewhat reticent about his own role in Daniel's investigation, finally shared a crucial interaction. 2 months ago, Daniel asked me to witness something without explaining why, he admitted. He took me to the firing range at an unusual hour, 400 before anyone else would arrive. Had me examine a crate of specialized ammunition that had been designated for destruction due to manufacturing defects. Katherine listened intently, sensing they were approaching the heart of what had driven Daniel to such extreme measures. The ammunition was perfect, no defects whatsoever. When I pointed this out, Daniel didn't seem surprised. He asked me to sign a statement confirming my inspection, had me place it in a sealed envelope, then took it without explanation. He was building his case, Katherine realized, creating a verified record with witnesses he trusted. Miller nodded solemnly. A week later, I overheard Colonel Harmon discussing equipment losses during training exercises with unusual satisfaction. Mentioned that defective shipment specifically, said it had been properly disposed of. The way he emphasized those words felt wrong. That same week, Daniel installed new security measures at our house, Katherine recalled. Said it was standard procedure after his promotion, but he was unusually insistent about learning the protocols, about what to do if certain alerts were triggered. The sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn glow as they reached the coordinates provided by Rebecca Townsend. They found themselves at the edge of a small clearing where a simple hunting cabin stood, its weathered exterior blending naturally with the surrounding forest. No lights shone from within, no smoke rose from the chimney, yet Shadow approached confidently, suggesting this was indeed their destination. The German Shepherd led them not to the main entrance but to a side door, partially concealed by overgrown bushes. The dog sat patiently beside it, looking at Katherine expectantly. "I think we need a key," Jessica observed, eyeing the sturdy padlock securing the door. Katherine remembered the key they'd discovered in the metal case along the trail, the one Shadow had led them to after they left the bunker. It fit perfectly, the lock opening with a satisfying click. Shadow entered first, performing a quick sweep of the interior before returning to the doorway with a soft whine that signaled the all clear. The cabin's interior was Spartan but functional. Basic furniture, a wood stove, shelves stocked with non-perishable supplies. A battery-powered lantern provided gentle illumination as dawn light began filtering through the windows. On a small table in the center of the main room lay a folder marked with Katherine's name in unfamiliar handwriting, presumably Rebecca Townsend's. Inside was a detailed timeline that finally provided the complete backstory of Daniel's investigation. According to the documents, Operation Switchback had been the cover for a sophisticated weapons diversion program operating within Fort Carson Special Operations Command. Under Colonel Harmon's direction, millions of dollars in advanced weapons and equipment had been deliberately misclassified, reported as training losses or defective materials, then diverted to private military contractors who resold them internationally. "This goes beyond simple profiteering," Miller said as they reviewed the evidence together. These weapons have been appearing in conflict zones where American forces and allies operate. They're creating danger for our own troops. The documentation revealed how Daniel had uncovered the scheme through his K9 security screening position. Shadow had been trained to detect specific explosive compounds present in military ordnance. During routine inspections, the dog had repeatedly alerted on crates that were subsequently removed from regular inventory, supposedly for disposal due to defects, but actually for diversion to Harmon's network. Daniel had begun documenting these discrepancies, matching Shadow's alerts with inventory reports and tracking the missing equipment through various administrative records. When he'd attempted to report his concerns through proper channels, he'd encountered obstruction and veiled threats. "That's when he went off the books," Katherine murmured, reading through his meticulous notes. "Started building his own investigation file, gathering evidence independently." The vehicle accident that had left Daniel with minor injuries was revealed to be no accident at all, but a deliberate warning. The timeline included photographs of tampered brake lines on Daniel's military vehicle, along with maintenance records that had been altered after the fact. Shadow settled beside Katherine as she continued reading, the dog's presence a tangible connection to her absent husband. The documents explained Daniel's decision to create the bunker, to train Shadow for contingency operations, to establish secure communications outside military networks. Each step had been a response to escalating threats as his investigation advanced. The final pages detailed the events that had precipitated Daniel's decision to fake his death. He had discovered that Colonel Harmon's weapons diversion scheme was merely the visible portion of a larger conspiracy, one that extended beyond Fort Carson to other installations and involved senior officers across multiple commands. The financial trails lead back to an operation called Cerberus, Katherine read aloud, her intelligence analyst background helping her process the complex information. A private military corporation officially contracted for training services, but actually serving as the conduit for diverted weapons. Miller leaned forward, studying the organizational chart included in the file. Some of these names, these are high-ranking officers with distinguished service records, the kind of people who shape military policy at the Pentagon level. Which explains why Daniel couldn't trust the normal reporting channels. Katherine concluded the conspiracy reached too high, compromised too many potential allies. The final document in the folder was a letter addressed directly to Katherine, written in the same unfamiliar hand as the folder label. Rebecca Townsend explained that she had been contacted by Daniel 3 months earlier, after the accident that had served as a warning. As an Army CID investigator operating outside Fort Carson's command structure, she had agreed to become Daniel's handler for what had essentially become an undercover operation against corrupt elements within their own military. Daniel's decision to fake his death was made when we discovered a surveillance operation targeting your home, Rebecca wrote. Colonel Harmon had authorized electronic monitoring of your residence and vehicles. The threat had moved beyond Daniel to potentially include you as a target. The empty coffin strategy was designed to achieve 2 objectives. Remove the immediate threat to your safety by creating the appearance that Daniel was no longer a concern, and provide a secure method to pass critical evidence to you through Shadow. Katherine set down the letter, emotions swirling as the complete backstory finally crystallized in her mind. Her husband hadn't just been investigating corruption, he had been protecting her from becoming collateral damage in a conspiracy that had already demonstrated its willingness to eliminate threats. The final phase begins at 0800, she read from Rebecca's concluding instructions. A secure vehicle will arrive at the western approach to the cabin. Daniel will not be present. He is currently documenting the offshore financial operations that connect Cerberus to Colonel Harmon and his associates. You will be transported to a safe location where your testimony and the evidence you've recovered will be presented to trusted authorities outside the compromised command structure. As dawn fully broke over the mountain valley, Katherine felt the weight of the past 24 hours, the shock of the empty coffin, the flight into the wilderness, the revelations of Daniel's secret investigation, settling into a strange new clarity. Her husband had embarked on a dangerous mission to expose corruption at the highest levels, had faked his own death to protect her while continuing his work. Shadow moved to the cabin's window, his attention fixed on the western approach where their transportation would eventually appear. The dog's unwavering focus reminded Katherine of Daniel's absolute trust in his canine partner, a trust that had proven justified at every turn. 2 hours until extraction, Miller noted, checking his watch. We should prepare the evidence and rest. While we can, Katherine nodded, her hand absently stroking Shadow's fur as she gazed out at the awakening forest. Somewhere out there, Daniel was completing his mission, unaware that she had successfully followed his breadcrumb trail, that she now understood the full scope of what he'd sacrificed to expose the truth. The backstory had been revealed, but the conclusion of their journey remained unwritten. The cabin provided a brief sanctuary as Katherine, Miller, and Jessica organized the evidence they had collected and prepared for the upcoming extraction. Shadow maintained his vigilant watch by the window, occasionally pacing to the door and back in a practiced pattern that suggested perimeter security, another behavior Daniel had clearly trained into his canine partner. We should review everything. On the flash drive before the transport arrives, Katherine decided, retrieving the small device from her pocket. If there's anything time-sensitive, we need to know now. Miller powered up a laptop they'd found stored in the cabin, an older model with no wireless capabilities, designed for secure offline operations. The flash drive contained dozens of meticulously organized folders, each labeled with dates and operation names. Daniel's military precision was evident in the systematic documentation of the weapons diversion scheme. "Look at this," Jessica said, pointing to a folder labeled Cerberus Principles that contained photographs and dossiers of key figures in the conspiracy. The images showed Colonel Harmon meeting with various civilian contractors and military personnel in locations ranging from official base facilities to remote warehouses and private residences. Katherine examined the photographs carefully, her intelligence analysis training helping her identify patterns in the interactions. These meetings follow a consistent sequence: base facilities for official transfers, then these remote locations for inventory adjustments, then private residences for what appear to be payment distributions. One folder contained financial records showing wire transfers to offshore accounts, carefully disguised as consulting fees for training services. The amounts corresponded precisely to the black market value of the weapons reported as lost or defective in official inventories. Daniel documented everything, Miller observed, impressed by the thoroughness of the evidence. Transaction dates, equipment serial numbers, comparative inventory reports showing the discrepancies. As they continued reviewing the files, Shadow suddenly stiffened by the window, his alert posture indicating detected movement outside. The German Shepherd didn't bark, instead dropping lower to maintain concealment while watching intently. Miller immediately moved to dim the laptop screen, gesturing for everyone to maintain silence. Through years of training and partnership with Daniel, Shadow had developed a sophisticated response system. His current behavior suggested potential threat. Detection without confirmation of hostile intent. Katherine moved quietly to a position where she could observe the western approach without being visible from outside. Through a small gap in the curtains, she spotted movement among the trees, approximately 100 yards from the cabin. A figure in woodland camouflage moving with tactical precision from one position of cover to another. "Military," she whispered to Miller, who had taken up a position at another window. "Single operator, using standard patrol movement techniques." Miller nodded grimly. "Our transport isn't due for another hour. Whoever this is arrived early and alone, which doesn't match extraction protocols." Shadow's attention remained fixed on the approaching figure, his body language communicating alert caution rather than immediate alarm. Katherine had seen this behavior before when Daniel conducted security assessments at their home. The dog was evaluating the potential threat, gathering information before committing to a response. "What do we do?" Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. Katherine considered their limited options. The cabin offered minimal defensive positions. They had no weapons beyond a hunting knife found in the supplies. Attempting to flee would expose them in the clearing surrounding the cabin. Their best advantage was Shadow's training and the element of surprise. The approaching operator might not know the cabin was occupied. "We wait," Katherine decided. "Let them approach. Shadow will give us warning if their intent becomes hostile." The minutes crawled by as the camouflaged figure methodically advanced toward the cabin, employing textbook cover and concealment techniques. Whoever this was had received formal military tactical training, moving during natural sound cover, breezing during quiet periods, never silhouetting against the horizon. Shadow's behavior shifted subtly as the figure closed to within 50 yards. The German Shepherd's ears pricked forward, his tail raising slightly from its previous lowered position. Katherine recognized this change, not a warning of threat, but recognition. "Shadow knows them," she whispered to Miller, who had positioned himself near the door. The approaching figure paused at the edge of the clearing, surveying the cabin carefully before making a direct approach to the front entrance. As they emerged, from the tree line into better visibility, Katherine could discern more details. Female, military bearing, carrying a sidearm in a tactical holster, but not drawn. The woman moved with the confident precision of someone conducting a security assessment rather than an assault. Shadow's behavior confirmed Katherine's growing suspicion. The dog was now showing anticipation rather than alert caution, watching the approaching woman with the familiarity of prior interaction. "I think it's Rebecca Townsend," Katherine said softly. "Daniel's CID handler." "Or someone pretending to be her," Miller cautioned. "Stay back while I make initial contact." The woman reached the cabin's front porch and paused, examining the exterior. Carefully before knocking, 3 distinct raps followed by 2 softer ones. A recognition pattern. Miller positioned himself to the side of the door, motioning for Katherine and Jessica to stay out of potential line of fire. "Identify yourself," he called through the closed door. "Sergeant First Class Rebecca Townsend, Army Criminal Investigation Division," came the clear response. Authentication phrase, "Timber Lake is where all paths lead home." Katherine moved forward, remembering the secondary authentication question from their satellite phone conversation. What was intercepted in the third quarter of the homecoming game? "A forward pass by Marcus Jenkins, quarterback for the Falcons," Rebecca replied without hesitation. Shadow's posture had relaxed completely, his tail now wagging slightly in recognition. The dog's assessment provided the final confirmation Katherine needed. She nodded to Miller, who carefully opened the door while maintaining a defensive position. Rebecca Townsend entered cautiously, her experienced eyes scanning the cabin interior before focusing on Katherine. She was younger than Katherine had expected, early 30s, with the compact build and alert posture of someone accustomed to fieldwork. Her camouflage uniform bore no insignia or rank indicators, standard procedure for covert operations. "Mrs. Reeves," she acknowledged with a nod. "Captain Miller, Shadow." She knelt briefly to allow the German Shepherd to approach and confirm her identity through scent. The dog performed a quick assessment before returning to Katherine's side. Having completed his verification, "You're early," Miller observed, the tension in his voice indicating he wasn't fully satisfied with the unexpected arrival. "Situations evolved," Rebecca replied crisply, removing her backpack and extracting a satellite communications device more advanced than the phone they'd used earlier. "Transport timeline has been accelerated. Colonel Harmon deployed search teams throughout this region after discovering the bunker was compromised." Katherine felt a chill of apprehension. "How did you find us? We followed the coordinates exactly." "I didn't track you," Rebecca clarified, setting up the communications equipment on the cabin's table. "I tracked them, multiple teams operating in a standard search grid pattern, moving from the bunker location outward. This cabin is designated as a rally point in Daniel's contingency plan. It was the logical place to intercept you before they did." The first real challenge of their journey was materializing. What had seemed like a straightforward extraction was rapidly evolving into a potential combat scenario. Katherine realized that their brief respite in the cabin had created a false sense of security. The hunting lodge wasn't just a waypoint, it was about to become the focal point of converging forces. "How many search teams?" Miller asked, his military training immediately focusing on tactical considerations. "3 that I've confirmed through observation," Rebecca replied, activating her communications equipment. "Standard 4-man fire teams operating in different sectors. 2 regular military police units and 1 special operations team that reports directly to Harmon." She spread a tactical map across the table, indicating their current position and the observed locations of the search teams. "The MP units are functioning as regular search and rescue. They've been told you're missing persons potentially in danger in the wilderness. Standard protocols, regular radio communications." Her finger moved to a different position on the map. "This team concerns me. Special operations operating on encrypted channels, moving with different search parameters. They're sweeping from building to building, securing each location with tactical entry procedures, not search and rescue methodology. This is a capture or neutralize operation." Katherine studied the map, her mind racing to process this new information. "How far out are they?" "The nearest MP team is approximately 3 miles northeast, moving in standard search grid." The Special Operations Team is more concerning. Last visual confirmation placed them 4 miles east, but they're using vehicles on fire roads to cover ground quickly between structures. They could reach this location within 30 minutes if they maintain current patterns. Rebecca continued setting up her communications equipment. Our extraction has been moved up. Transport will arrive in 20 minutes at an alternate landing zone half a mile west of this position. We need to be there before the Special Operations Team completes their sweep of the eastern approach. The immediacy of the threat crystallized. In Katherine's mind, this wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. They were now actively evading capture by forces that might have authorization to use lethal methods. The careful planning Daniel had put into place was being tested by the accelerating timeline. "What about Daniel?" Katherine asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since discovering the empty coffin. "Is he secure? Does he know what's happening?" Rebecca's expression revealed little, her CID training evident in her careful control. "Daniel is completing the final phase of evidence collection. His status was secure as of our last communication 6 hours ago. He's aware the bunker was compromised and has implemented additional security protocols." Shadow suddenly moved to the window again, his attention focusing intently on the eastern perimeter of the clearing. His posture communicated alert caution rather than immediate threat. Something or someone was approaching, but not yet close. Enough for full threat assessment. Rebecca noticed the dog's behavior immediately. Shadow's been trained for early perimeter warning. If he's alerting now, we may have less time than expected. Miller moved quickly to the window, using tactical observation techniques to minimize his visibility. Movement in the tree line, east, side, single scout, tactical positioning. The first real challenge of their journey had arrived. They were cornered in the cabin with enemy forces approaching and extraction still 20 minutes away. Katherine felt a momentary wave of fear before her military spouse training took over. Years of preparing for crisis situations, of practicing emergency protocols with Daniel, steadied her nerves. "Options?" she asked simply, looking between Miller and Rebecca. Rebecca was already packing her communications equipment, moving with practiced efficiency. "Standard evasion protocol. We move immediately along the western exit route, maintain cover until we reach the extraction point. Use terrain features to break line of sight. Shadow provides early warning of pursuit." Miller nodded in agreement. "The Special Operations Team will secure and clear the cabin. Standard procedure would have them establish a perimeter first, which buys us time if we move now." Katherine looked to Jessica, who appeared understandably frightened, but was maintaining her composure. "Stay between Captain Miller and me," she instructed her sister. "Move exactly as we move. Step where we step. We've trained for this." It wasn't entirely true. Katherine had never personally trained for wilderness evasion, but the confidence in her voice helped steady Jessica's nerves. Years of military spouse briefings and Daniel's insistence on family emergency planning had prepared her better than most civilians for crisis response. Shadow's attention remained fixed on the eastern perimeter, but his behavior indicated the threat wasn't yet immediate. The German Shepherd waited by the cabin's western exit, clearly aware of their escape route and ready to lead the way. "The evidence?" Miller asked, indicating the laptop and flash drive. "Bring the flash drive," Rebecca instructed, handing him a small waterproof pouch. "Leave the laptop. It contains nothing that isn't backed up elsewhere, and we need to travel light. Katherine gathered only essential supplies: water, the satellite phone, Daniel's letter, and the flash drive Miller had secured. Everything else would be left behind, potentially sacrificed to buy them time if the Special Operations Team focused on searching the cabin before expanding their pursuit. Rebecca performed a final communications check on a secure, handheld radio. Extraction team confirms approaching landing zone, 20 minutes until arrival. We need to move now to secure the site. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the cabin, Katherine felt the full weight of their situation. This was no longer about following breadcrumbs or solving the mystery of Daniel's empty coffin. They were actively evading potentially hostile forces while carrying evidence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of military command. Shadow led the way as they slipped out the cabin's western exit, moving immediately into the cover of dense underbrush rather than taking the more obvious trail. The German shepherd's tactical movement training was evident. He selected a route that maximized concealment while providing efficient progress toward their destination. Katherine followed closely, helping Jessica navigate the difficult terrain, while Miller and Rebecca maintained security positions at the rear of their small group. The Special Operations Team hadn't yet reached the cabin, but Shadow's periodic alerts indicated they were closing the distance on the eastern approach. The first real challenge of their journey had materialized, testing the planning and training Daniel had invested in his contingency operations. As they moved through the forest toward the extraction point, Katherine found herself grateful for her husband's foresight, his preparation for this exact scenario, his training of Shadow for independent operations, his careful selection of trustworthy allies like Rebecca Townsend. The path ahead would test every aspect of that preparation. Their immediate challenge was reaching the extraction point before the Special Operations Team discovered the empty cabin and expanded their search. But beyond that immediate threat loomed larger questions. Who could they trust with the evidence they carried? How deep did Colonel Harmon's conspiracy extend into the military command structure? And most importantly, when would Katherine finally reunite with the husband whose empty coffin had set this entire journey in motion? Shadow paused, momentarily at the crest of a small ridge, looking back to ensure everyone was following, before continuing toward the extraction point. In the German shepherd's unwavering focus, Katherine found the resolve to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Daniel had trusted Shadow to guide her safely through this dangerous passage. Now, she needed to trust herself to complete the mission. Her husband had begun. The sound of a helicopter approached from the west, their extraction arriving right on schedule. The first major challenge of their journey was about to reach its critical moment, testing whether Daniel's meticulous planning would withstand the pressure of active pursuit. The helicopter appeared above the clearing, a sleek, unmarked Bell model, commonly used for civilian operations rather than military transport. Its nondescript appearance was clearly deliberate, nothing that would attract attention as government or armed forces equipment. Shadow showed no alarm at the aircraft's arrival, instead leading them confidently toward the designated landing zone with the certainty of prior training. "Standard civilian contractor," Rebecca shouted over the growing noise of the rotors. "Plausible deniability, nothing traceable to military operations." The pilot executed a practice touchdown in the small clearing, keeping the engines running, for a rapid departure. As the side door slid open, Katherine was startled to see a familiar face, Lieutenant Colonel James Westbrook, her former supervisor from her days as an intelligence analyst before she'd left the service to support Daniel's career. "Katherine!" Westbrook called, gesturing urgently for them to board. "We need to be airborne in 90 seconds." The unexpected appearance of her former commanding officer momentarily froze Katherine in confusion. Westbrook had retired 3 years earlier after a distinguished 30-year career in military intelligence. His presence here, involved in a covert operation concerning internal military corruption, raised immediate questions about the scope of Daniel's investigation network. Shadow showed no hesitation, bounding into the helicopter with practiced efficiency. Another indication that this was part of Daniel's contingency planning. The German Shepherd's acceptance of Westbrook provided the reassurance Katherine needed to overcome her momentary doubt. They boarded quickly, Rebecca taking the final position to secure the door as the pilot immediately began ascent procedures. Through the windows, Katherine caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the forest. The special operations team had reached the cabin's perimeter just as they were lifting off. "Cutting it close," Westbrook observed grimly as the helicopter banked sharply, using the terrain to break line of sight with the ground forces. "Another 2 minutes and we'd have had company." As they gained altitude, Katherine studied the man who had once been her mentor in military intelligence. James Westbrook had been renowned for his integrity and analytical brilliance. Someone who had navigated the complex politics of Pentagon operations while maintaining an unwavering commitment to protecting American forces and interests. His silver hair was cropped in the same military precision as during his active service, his weathered face bearing the additional lines of the intervening years. "I have about 1,000 questions right now," Katherine said once they were safely airborne. The cabin noise reduced enough for conversation. Westbrook's expression softened slightly. "I imagine you do. Daniel said you'd be thorough once you started putting the pieces together. You've been in contact with my husband. The confirmation that Daniel was coordinating with Westbrook added another layer to the already complex operation for the past 4 months, Westbrook confirmed. Since he discovered the weapons diversion scheme extended beyond Fort Carson to several other installations, he needed someone with connections outside the potentially compromised command structure, someone who could verify his findings independently. The helicopter continued its flight path away from the mountains, heading toward the eastern plains of Colorado. Katherine noticed they were flying unusually low, utilizing terrain features to minimize radar visibility, standard evasion techniques for covert operations. "Where are we going?" Jessica asked, still trying to process the rapid sequence of events that had transformed her simple visit to support her sister into an escape from armed pursuers. "Temporary safe location," Westbrook replied. "A private property I maintain under a corporate entity. No connection to the military or government. We'll regroup there, assess the evidence you've recovered, and plan next steps." Katherine felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, the physical manifestation of Daniel's year-long investigation, containing evidence significant enough to warrant faking his own death. And Daniel? Will he be there? A shadow crossed Westbrook's face. "That's complicated. Daniel is deep in the final phase of documentation. Direct contact represents significant risk until we've secured proper channels for the evidence. The non-answer triggered Katherine's analytical instincts. There was something Westbrook wasn't telling them. Information he was deliberately withholding until they reached the safe location. Shadow seemed to sense her unease, pressing against her leg in a gesture of reassurance developed through years of partnership with Daniel. As the helicopter continued eastward, Westbrook began providing context that filled crucial gaps in their understanding. His role as mentor and helper became evident as he outlined the broader picture of the investigation Daniel had initiated. Daniel contacted me after discovering the first evidence of weapons diversion, Westbrook explained. His position in K9 security screening provided unique access. Shadow's training allowed him to identify discrepancies that human inspectors were missing or deliberately overlooking. Miller nodded in understanding. The specialized ordnance, detection training, Shadow could identify weapons and ammunition by their chemical signatures, even when physically concealed. Precisely, Westbrook confirmed. What began as routine security inspections revealed a pattern of discrepancies. Equipment that triggered Shadow's alerts would subsequently disappear from inventory, officially recorded as training losses or defective materials slated for destruction. Rebecca joined the conversation, adding details from her perspective as Daniel's CID handler. When Sergeant Reeves attempted to report through normal channels, he encountered resistance. His immediate superiors instructed him to focus on his assigned duties and leave inventory reconciliation to the appropriate departments. That's when he began documenting independently, Katherine surmised, the timeline aligning with the changes she'd observed in her husband's behavior, using Shadow's alerts as the starting point to track the diverted weapons. Westbrook's expression remained serious. The scope of the operation became clear only gradually. What initially appeared to be localized corruption, perhaps officers supplementing their income through black market sales, revealed itself as something far more systematic and concerning. He produced a tablet from a secure case displaying a complex organizational chart that expanded on the information from Daniel's files. Operation Cerberus isn't just diverting weapons for profit. They're strategically placing American armaments in specific global hotspots, creating instability that justifies expanded military budgets and operations. Katherine studied the chart, her intelligence analysis background helping her grasp the implications. They're manufacturing conflicts to drive military spending, while simultaneously positioning themselves to profit from both ends, Westbrook confirmed. The diverted weapons generate immediate black market profits, while the resulting instability creates justification for increased defense contracts. Many directed to companies where these same officers hold financial interests through proxies and shell corporations. The helicopter began its descent toward what appeared to be an isolated ranch property on the eastern Colorado plains. The compound below featured a main house, several outbuildings, and security features subtly integrated into the seemingly rustic setting. "Welcome to Clearwater Ranch," Westbrook announced as they touched down on a private helipad. Officially, a corporate retreat facility. Unofficially, my retirement project and occasional safe house for sensitive operations. As they disembarked, Katherine noticed additional security personnel positioned discreetly around the property. Professionals with the unmistakable bearing of former special operations personnel, maintaining watch positions with practiced efficiency. Shadow immediately performed a perimeter check of the landing zone, his training seamlessly transitioning to the new environment. The German Shepherd's behavior continued to provide Katherine with reassurance. If Daniel had included this location in Shadow's operational programming, it represented a significant level of trust in Westbrook. The main house proved to be a sophisticated operations center disguised as a rustic ranch home. Behind the Western decor and comfortable furnishings lay state-of-the-art communications equipment, secured computer systems, and the infrastructure necessary for coordinating complex intelligence operations. Daniel helped design these security systems last year, Westbrook explained, as he led them into a conference room at the center of the house. Part of his contingency planning, though at the time I thought he was being overly cautious. The revelation that Daniel had been preparing fallback positions and secure communications channels a full year earlier underscored the methodical nature of his investigation. What Katherine had interpreted as increasing work demands had actually been her husband systematically constructing an infrastructure to expose corruption at the highest levels of military command. Westbrook activated a secure terminal connecting to encrypted servers that contained backups of Daniel's evidence. Rebecca ran the file comparison protocol, confirmed that the flash drive contains the complete data set. As Rebecca began the technical verification process, Westbrook turned his full attention to Katherine. The mentor-student dynamic from their days in military intelligence reasserted itself naturally as he outlined the next phase of operations. "Daniel always said your analytical skills were exceptional," he began, a hint of pride in his voice. "Said you could spot patterns that others missed, connections that weren't immediately obvious. We need those skills now, Katherine. The evidence is comprehensive but complex. We need to identify the most compelling narrative before taking this to trusted authorities." Katherine felt a surge of purpose at Westbrook's words. After months of being kept in the dark about Daniel's investigation, after days of following breadcrumbs and reacting to events, she was being invited to actively contribute her professional expertise to completing her husband's mission. Shadow settled beside her chair, the German Shepherd's alertness moderated by the secure environment. The dog's behavior suggested they had reached a temporary safe harbor in their journey, a place where Katherine could transition from fugitive to analyst, using her intelligence training to help organize and interpret the evidence Daniel had risked everything to collect. "Where do we start?" she asked, ready to immerse herself in the investigation. Westbrook spread a physical copy of the organizational chart across the conference table. "Daniel mapped the operational structure, but we need to identify the pressure points, the vulnerabilities, where the conspiracy can be broken open. You know how these military networks function, the formal and informal channels of influence and authority." For the next several hours, Katherine immersed herself in the evidence Daniel had accumulated. The comprehensive nature of his documentation impressed even her experienced analytical eye. Financial records, surveillance photographs, shipping manifests, comparison analyses of reported versus actual equipment deployments. Each piece meticulously cross-referenced and corroborated from multiple sources. As she worked, Westbrook provided invaluable contextual information. The backgrounds of key figures in the conspiracy, historical patterns of similar operations, potential allies and obstacles within the military and civilian oversight structures. His role as mentor became increasingly evident. guiding Katherine through the complex landscape of military politics and counterintelligence operations without directing her conclusions. "Daniel was right to trust you with this," Westbrook observed, as Katherine identified a key vulnerability in Colonel Harmon's operational security. "You're seeing connections even he missed." The praise from her former commander helped restore Katherine's confidence, which had been shaken by the revelation of how much Daniel had concealed from her. Through Westbrook's mentorship, she began to understand her husband's actions, not as a betrayal of trust, but as a calculated risk assessment, compartmentalizing information to protect her while creating a path for her involvement when the time was right. As evening approached, Rebecca returned with the results of the technical analysis. The flash drive contains all critical documentation, plus additional files not present in our existing backups. Daniel continued gathering evidence even after implementing the disappearance protocol. This confirmation reinforced Katherine's growing appreciation of her husband's methodical approach. Even while orchestrating his own fake death and establishing escape routes, he had maintained his investigative discipline, accumulating additional evidence against Colonel Harmon and the Cerberus operation. "There's one piece missing," Katherine noted, reviewing the assembled evidence. "The offshore financial records Daniel mentioned in his letter, the accounts where the weapons profits are being directed. Without those, we have comprehensive documentation of the diversion scheme, but incomplete proof of who ultimately benefits." Westbrook exchanged a significant glance with Rebecca before responding. "That's the final phase Daniel is currently executing. Following the money to its ultimate destination, identifying not just the operational participants, but the strategic architects of the entire conspiracy." Something in his tone triggered Katherine's analytical instincts again. "There's more you're not telling me." The conference room fell silent as Westbrook considered his response. Shadow shifted position, moving to sit directly beside Katherine, a subtle but meaningful gesture of support. "The financial trail leads to places we didn't anticipate," Westbrook finally admitted. "Individuals whose involvement creates significant jurisdictional and security complications. Daniel is currently in a position to document those connections directly, but it places him at extreme risk." Katherine felt a cold weight settling in her stomach. "How extreme?" "The kind that necessitated convincing his wife he was dead," Westbrook replied grimly. "The kind that requires absolute operational security." Before Katherine could press further, Shadow suddenly lifted his head, attention focused on the conference room door, seconds before a secure communication alert sounded from Westbrook's equipment. The timing suggested another aspect of the German Shepherd's specialized training, the ability to detect electronic signals before they became audible to human ears. Westbrook activated the secure channel, his expression shifting from concern to focused intensity as he received the incoming transmission. The conference room remained silent, except for the muted sounds of encrypted communication, every person present understanding the potential significance of this unexpected contact. When Westbrook finally looked up, his expression had transformed completely, a mixture of relief and renewed urgency. "That was our secure relay. Daniel has completed the financial documentation phase and is inbound to this location. Estimated arrival in 3 hours." Katherine felt a surge of emotions: relief, anticipation, lingering hurt, and overwhelming hope. After everything they had experienced since opening that empty coffin, she would finally see her husband again. The mentor and helper Westbrook had provided had guided her through understanding Daniel's investigation. Now she would confront the reality of the man himself, no longer a ghost whose absence had driven her journey, but a living presence who would need to explain his choices and trust her with the truth. Shadow's demeanor shifted subtly, the German Shepherd sensing the changed emotional dynamics in the room. His training had prepared him for complex human interactions, and his bond with both Katherine and Daniel allowed him to serve as an emotional bridge between them. The distant sound of an approaching vehicle broke the tense silence that had settled over Clearwater Ranch. Shadow immediately moved to the window, his body language shifting from relaxed alertness to focused anticipation. Katherine joined him, her heart pounding as headlights appeared on the private access road leading to the main house. "Security protocols confirmed," Rebecca announced after checking the property's surveillance system. "It's Daniel's transport." Katherine stepped onto the front porch, Shadow at her side, as the unmarked SUV pulled up to the main house. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, nothing happened. Then the rear door opened, and Daniel Reeves emerged into the soft glow of the porch lights. He looked exhausted but very much alive, thinner than when she'd last seen him, with several days' worth of beard shadowing his face. Their eyes locked across the short distance, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them in that silent exchange. Shadow broke the spell, bounding forward with a joyful bark that echoed across the ranch property. Daniel knelt to greet his canine partner, emotion cracking his composed exterior as the German Shepherd enthusiastically confirmed his handler was real, alive, and present. When Daniel finally stood and approached Katherine, his steps were hesitant, uncertain of his reception. After the deception that had brought them to this moment. "Katie," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. She closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, her response a complex fusion of embrace and confrontation, holding him fiercely while simultaneously pressing him with the weight of everything she'd endured since Shadow's desperate barking at his empty coffin. "You died," she whispered against his shoulder. "I mourned you." "I know," Daniel replied, holding her just as tightly. "I'm so sorry." Inside the house, Daniel placed a hard drive on the conference table, the final piece of evidence he'd risked everything to secure. Offshore accounts linking Colonel Harmon and his network to 3 Pentagon officials and a Deputy Secretary of Defense, he explained, as Westbrook connected the drive to their secure system. Complete financial trails showing how weapons sales, profits were being channeled back into defense appropriation decisions. As the files transferred, Daniel finally shared the full story of his year-long investigation, the threats that had escalated until they targeted Katherine, and the desperate decision to fake his death. "When they started surveillance on our home, I knew they'd identified you as my vulnerability," he explained. The empty coffin strategy accomplished multiple objectives. It removed the immediate threat to your safety by creating the appearance that I was no longer a concern. It provided a secure method to pass critical evidence to you through Shadow, and it gave me operational freedom to secure the final financial documentation. Katherine listened, her intelligence analyst's mind processing the strategic logic, while her heart grappled with the emotional impact of his choices. "You trusted Shadow to guide me, but you couldn't trust me with the truth?" Daniel's expression reflected deep regret. "I trusted you completely, with my life, with the evidence, with everything that matters. What I couldn't risk was putting you in a position where your genuine grief wasn't convincing. These people are experts at detecting deception. Your authentic mourning protected you in ways that knowledge never could. Shadow moved between them, sensing the emotional tension and offering his presence as a bridge. The living embodiment of the trust that had connected them even when circumstances had forced them apart. By dawn, Katherine, Daniel, and Westbrook had assembled the complete case against Operation Cerberus. The evidence was irrefutable. A comprehensive documentation of weapons diversion, financial profiteering, and deliberate destabilization of global regions to justify expanded military operations. We can't take this through normal channels, Westbrook concluded. The corruption extends too high into the chain of command. The Inspector General's Independent Counsel, Katherine suggested, her analyst's mind identifying the appropriate oversight authority. With supporting documentation simultaneously provided to the Armed Services Committee chairs in both congressional chambers. Daniel nodded, pride evident in his expression. Exactly what I was thinking. Create multiple simultaneous disclosure points so the evidence can't be buried. As they prepared the final documentation packages, the ranch's security system alerted them to approaching vehicles. Multiple heavy transports moving with tactical coordination. "They've found us," Rebecca announced grimly, bringing up the surveillance feeds. 2 armored personnel carriers, support vehicles, military markings removed. Daniel moved with immediate purpose, activating a hidden panel in the conference room wall to reveal an emergency arsenal. "Contingency protocol," he explained, distributing tactical equipment to Westbrook's security team. Katherine watched as her husband transformed before her eyes, the dedicated investigator becoming the combat-trained operator his military record had only hinted at. This was yet another aspect of Daniel she was seeing clearly for the first time. The tactical commander who had planned for every contingency, including a direct assault on their secure location. "The evidence is what matters," Daniel insisted, as Westbrook's team prepared defensive positions. "Katherine, you and Rebecca take the helicopter with the complete documentation packages. Shadow will go with you." "I'm not leaving you," Katherine protested, the echo of their separation still too raw. Daniel took her hands, his expression more open and vulnerable than she'd seen since his return. "This isn't like before. I'm not sending you away to protect you from the truth. I'm asking you to complete the mission because you're the one person I trust completely to see it through." Shadow pressed against her leg. The German Shepherd's training allowing him to understand the significance of the moment. The dog who had refused to accept Daniel's death, who had led Katherine faithfully through every challenge, was now prepared to continue their journey. In that moment, Katherine recognized the truth that transcended the deception and separation they'd endured. Daniel had always trusted her with the most important aspects of his investigation, with Shadow as his most valued partner, and ultimately with ensuring that the truth would reach those who could act on it. As the helicopter lifted off, Katherine watched Daniel coordinating the ranch's defense, buying time for their escape with the evidence that would expose corruption at the highest levels of military command. This time, their separation wasn't based on deception, but on shared purpose, each fulfilling the role they were best equipped to perform. Shadow sat alert beside her, his mission continuing as they carried the evidence toward justice. The German Shepherd, who had barked desperately at an empty coffin, had fulfilled his handler's trust, bringing Katherine not just to Daniel, but to the truth he had risked everything to uncover. 3 days later, as the first arrests were being made and the Cerberus conspiracy was unraveling under the weight of congressional investigation, Katherine and Shadow stood on the tarmac of a secured airfield. The helicopter's approach signaled the final reunion. Daniel and Westbrook returning from their successful defense of the ranch, the mission completed through their combined efforts. As Daniel embraced her, Shadow circled them both, the three, reunited at last, not just as a family restored, but as partners who had exposed corruption that threatened the very principles they had sworn to defend. The empty coffin that had started their journey had contained more than just a flash drive. With evidence, it had held the seed of truth that, nurtured by trust and pursuit, had grown into justice. If you've been captivated by this story of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a handler and his canine partner, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary tales that will leave you amazed and inspired. Hit that like button, share with friends who appreciate stories of justice prevailing against all odds, and leave a comment telling us what shocked you most about this incredible journey. Remember, sometimes the most faithful companions are the ones who refuse to believe what everyone else accepts as truth. See you in our next video.